The man fell against her gate like something the night had finished with and thrown away, and Hester Rourke heard him hit the wood from 30 feet inside her darkened house. She had not been sleeping. She rarely slept well those days, not since the winter had come early to the New Mexico territory and taken with it what little warmth the house had held since her husband Edmund had died the spring before. She lay in her bed most nights with her eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling plaster, listening to the wind move through the cottonwood trees along the creek, listening to the horses shift in the barn, listening to the particular silence that settled over a homestead when there was only one person left to keep it. She was 28 years old and she had not planned to be alone, and the aloneness had a weight to it that pressed down on her chest in the dark hours before dawn. The sound that woke her from that half-waking state was not subtle. It was the crash of something heavy against the cedar planks of her front gate, followed by a lower, softer sound that she could not immediately identify. Then she understood it. It was a person trying to catch themselves on something and failing. Hester sat up. She reached beneath her pillow for the small derringer she kept there, an old habit Edmund had insisted on, and one she had kept long after he was gone to insist on it himself. She pulled on her boots and her wool robe over her nightgown, and she crossed the dark house without lighting a lamp, moving by memory past the kitchen table, around the rocking chair near the window, to the front door. She unlatched it and eased it open 2 inches and peered out into the pewter light of a December morning in the year 1879. The gate was standing open. Something dark was collapsed against the bottom of it, something large enough to be a man. She did not call out. She watched for a long moment, the derringer warm in her hand, her breath making small clouds in the freezing air. The shape did not move. The horses in the barn shifted again. Somewhere down the road, a coyote called once and went quiet. The shape remained motionless on her frozen ground. Hester pushed the door open wider and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit her immediately, sharp as a blade through the wool robe. She crossed the yard in quick steps, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth, her eyes moving from the collapsed figure to the road beyond the gate and back again. There was no horse. There was no other person visible in either direction along the road. There was only the man, and the dark stain spreading slowly into the dirt beneath him, and the ragged sound of breathing that she could hear now that she was close enough. She crouched beside him and turned him over. He was a white man, young, perhaps 30 years old or somewhere near it, with dark hair gone stiff with dried blood on one side, and a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so gray with pain and cold. He wore a trail-worn canvas coat that had seen considerable weather and boots that had walked a very long distance. The dark stain beneath him was coming from his left side, where something had opened him up and left him bleeding in a way that had not fully stopped. His eyes opened when she turned him. They were dark brown and they looked at her without full comprehension, the way a person looks when they are between the waking world and somewhere else entirely. "Can you hear me?" she said. His lips moved. She leaned closer. "Gate," he said. "Your gate, I saw the light." She looked back at her house. She had left the front door open, and the faint glow of the banked fire in the hearth was visible through it, a thin orange thread in the darkness. "I've got you," she said, and she meant it. She was a strong woman. Edmund had always said so, not always kindly, as if strength in a woman was something that needed to be noted with a certain careful neutrality. She had run the homestead through a drought and a difficult winter and a flood year, and she had done most of that with a husband who was better with charm than with labor. She got her arms under the man, and she hauled him upright with the kind of effort that leaves marks in the muscles for days afterward, and she got him moving toward her door. He was trying to help her. She could feel him working with her rather than against her, trying to get his feet under him, and she was grateful for that because without his cooperation she would not have managed it. He was tall, and the dead weight of him was considerable even when he was doing his best to carry some of it himself. She got him through the front door and got the door shut behind them and got him down onto the old horsehair settee in the front room, which was the closest flat surface, And then she straightened up and took stock of the situation with the same clear-eyed practicality she applied to everything that needed doing on the homestead. He was bleeding from his left side. The wound was a gunshot. She could see that much even in the dim light of the fire, the particular character of the tear in his clothing, the way the blood had spread. She did not know when he had been shot or how far he had traveled since, or whether the bullet was still in him. She lit the lamp on the side table and knelt beside him, and she opened his coat. The wound was below his ribs on the left side. It had bled considerably, but the bleeding had slowed, which could mean it had clotted or could mean he had very little blood left to lose. She needed to know if the bullet had passed through. She turned him gently onto his right side, and she found the exit wound, smaller and cleaner, in his back. The bullet had gone through. That was something. That was a significant something. "You're going to tell me your name," she said, speaking clearly and steadily, "and then you're going to lie still while I clean this." He opened his eyes again. The firelight caught in them. "Tobias," he said, "Tobias Prescott." "Hester Rourke," she said. "This is my homestead. You are safe here." She could not know if that last part was entirely true, not knowing what had put that bullet in him or whether it had friends looking for him, but she said it with conviction because he needed to hear it, and because she intended to make it true. She went to the kitchen and put water on the stove, and she got the tin box from the top shelf where she kept her medical supplies, which were modest but adequate. Clean linen for bandaging, a bottle of carbolic acid that a physician in Albuquerque had recommended the year before when she had read about its uses in an old medical pamphlet, a needle and thread for suturing, laudanum. She had used all of these things before. She had stitched a ranch hand's arm closed after a fence wire incident, and she had sat with Edmund through his final illness, which had been a pneumonia that moved fast and took him before she could do much more than witness it. She knew the difference between what could be helped and what could not, and she had learned to be honest with herself about it. This wound could be helped. Tobias Prescott had made it to her gate with a bullet wound in his side and a body temperature that was dangerously low and some quantity of blood loss that she could only estimate, and he was still breathing and still conscious enough to tell her his name, and those were encouraging facts. She cleaned the wounds as thoroughly as she knew how, and he lay still through most of it with his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides, and when she began the suturing, he made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite anything else, and she said, "I know," and kept working. She gave him a small measure of the laudanum when she was done, and she got a blanket over him, and she put another log on the fire, and she sat in the rocking chair and watched him for the remainder of the night. The sun came up the color of a bruise over the Sandia Mountains to the east, and Tobias Prescott was still breathing. By the time full morning had come, Hester had made up her mind about several things. She had decided she would not send to Cimarron for the doctor right away, because the road was a full day's ride, and the doctor was not always at his office, and the time it would take to send for him and have him come back was time during which Tobias Prescott might improve or might not. And if he was going to do either of those things, he was better served by her immediate attention than by a long wait. She had decided she would not send for the sheriff either, at least not yet, because she did not know the whole story of the bullet, and she was not the kind of woman who made assumptions. She had decided she would keep him in the front room for now because the guest bedroom was cold, and the front room had the fire, and proximity to the fire was what mattered most. She had also decided, in the quiet way she made most of her decisions, that she would not be frightened of him. He was injured and alone, and he had come to her gate in the dark of a winter morning because he had seen a light, and there was nothing about that frightened her. There was, if she was honest, something about it that touched her in a place she had thought was closed off. He slept through most of that first day. She went about her work, feeding the horses and the 2 milk cows, gathering the eggs from the 6 hens she kept in the small coop beside the barn, checking the fence line along the north pasture that had been giving her trouble. The air was sharp and cold, and the mountains to the east were white-capped, and she worked steadily, and without complaint because that was how she worked. She had a Mexican neighbor, Senora Vasquez, who lived a mile and a half down the road and who came sometimes to trade eggs for cheese or to help with the heavier mending. And she thought briefly about telling Senora Vasquez about her unexpected guest, but she decided to wait. She wanted to know more about him first. He was awake when she came back in at midday, lying still on the settee with his eyes open, watching the ceiling beams with the careful attention of a man who is taking inventory of where he is and how he got there. He heard her come in and turned his head carefully and looked at her with those dark eyes that were clearer now than they had been in the night. "You stitched me up," he said. "I did. You're good at it. My husband was not careful around fence wire." Something crossed his face. She hung up her coat on the peg by the door and went to the kitchen to wash her hands. "Your husband," he said from the front room. "Is he going to come home and shoot me for taking his settee?" "He died in the spring," she said. "Pneumonia." A silence fell and she filled it by putting the kettle on. "I'm sorry," he said, and it sounded like he meant it in a way that went past politeness. "So am I," she said. "Now tell me where you came from and who shot you." She came back to the doorway of the front room and leaned against the frame with her arms crossed, looking at him with the direct, patient expression that had worn down more stubborn silences than his over the years. He studied her for a moment. He had the look of a man who was deciding how much truth to spend. "I've been riding for about 4 months," he said. "Working wherever I could find work. Cattle drives, some carpentry, whatever needed doing. I was in a saloon in Springer 3 nights ago when a man I'd had words with before decided to settle it with a gun instead of more words. I came out better than he did." He paused. "That part might be why there's been someone following me." "His friends," she said. "His brother," he said. "Or so I was told." I didn't stop to make a formal introduction. I rode out of Springer that night and I kept riding, and somewhere along the way I started bleeding worse than I realized, and my horse gave out on me about 2 miles up the road. He looked at her steadily. "I walked from there. I saw your light." She considered this. It was not an improbable story for the territory in 1879. The railroad had been pushing through and men had followed it, and where men gathered in numbers and uncertainty, violence gathered with them. She did not excuse the violence, but she understood it as a fact of the landscape she lived in. "The man in Springer," she said. "Was the fight his making or yours?" "His," Tobias said. "He was the kind of man who looks for reasons. I suppose I gave him one by being present." She looked at him for another moment, and then she went back to the kitchen and put together a broth from the stock she kept on the stove, and she brought it to him and she helped him sit up enough to take it, and she watched him drink it with the steady hunger of a man who has not eaten in longer than he is willing to say. "The brother," she said when he had finished. "Do you think he's still following you?" "I think I lost him in the dark," Tobias said, "but I've been wrong before." "I have a rifle," she said. "And I know how to use it." He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts startled and something she thought might be admiring. "I don't doubt it," he said. She took the bowl back to the kitchen, and she thought about the situation with the same clear pragmatism she applied to everything else. A man with a possible pursuer was a complication. A wounded man with a possible pursuer on her property was a larger complication. But the man was wounded, and it was December, and she was not going to put him back out into the cold on the chance that someone might come looking for him. She had made the decision to pull him inside, and she was not in the habit of making decisions she then refused to honor. She brought in extra firewood that afternoon. She checked the loads on the rifle and the shotgun she kept by the door. She made a proper supper of beans and salt pork and cornbread, and she sat at the kitchen table and ate while he ate on the settee, and they talked more, carefully at first and then with increasing ease. The way conversation flows when two people discover they are interested in each other's thinking. He was from Missouri originally. He had come west after the war, though he had been too young to fight in it, and said so without apology, only with a kind of quiet relief. He had tried farming in Kansas and had found he preferred moving. He had done a season on the good night-loving trail in Texas, and another driving horses up from Mexico before the fever had caught up with that operation. He had been drifting since, following work and weather with no particular direction in mind. No family, she asked. A sister in St. Louis, he said. We write when I have an address to send letters to. She thought about that. The particular freedom and particular loneliness of having no fixed place. And what were you looking for, she asked. Before the bullet. He thought about it seriously, the way she had discovered he thought about most things. I think I was looking for something that felt like staying, he said. I just hadn't found what would make that possible. She did not say anything to that. She cleared the supper things and she checked his wound and found it holding clean, and she said good night, and she went to her bedroom and she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and thought that she had not talked that much with another person in several months. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning she woke to find him standing at the kitchen window in the gray light before sunrise, watching the road, and she understood that he had woken early to check it, that he had probably been doing this each morning while she slept. Nothing, she said. He turned around. He was moving better than he had been, still careful with his left side but no longer gray with pain. Nothing, he said. I think he's not coming, or he turned back. She put the coffee on. You could stay a few more days, she said, as if she were talking about the weather. That wound needs more time. He looked at her back since she was facing the stove. I don't want to cause you trouble, he said. You're not cause, she said. You're a man with a healing wound in December in New Mexico territory. There's no sensible argument for you going anywhere. He sat down at the kitchen table and she could feel him looking at the back of her head. You don't know anything about me, he said. Not really. She turned around with the coffee pot and she looked at him directly. I know you tried to catch yourself on my gate so you wouldn't hit the ground hard, she said. I know you walked 2 miles with a bullet wound because you needed to. I know you've been checking the road every morning so that if trouble comes to this property it finds you before it finds me. That's not nothing. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I suppose it's not. She poured the coffee and she sat across from him, and the morning came in through the window between them, cold and bright, and full of that particular desert light that makes everything look both sharp and new. He did not leave after 3 more days. He did not leave because his wound became infected on the 5th day, and she fought the infection with hot compresses and carbolic acid and very little sleep for 48 hours. And when the fever broke and he lay drenched and exhausted on the settee, he looked up at her with eyes that had the particular expression of a man who has just been pulled back from something and knows it. Hester, he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the formal context of introduction. You need sleep, she said. So do you, he said. You look like you haven't stopped since this started. I'll sleep when you don't have a fever. It broke 2 hours ago. Then I'll sleep when I'm satisfied it won't come back. He put his hand out and caught her wrist, just the lightest pressure, not restraining but present. Thank you, he said. I don't say that lightly. I know you don't, she said. She did not move her wrist for a moment, and neither did he, and then she gently withdrew it and went to make fresh broth, and she was very careful not to think about the warmth of his hand or the way her name had sounded in his voice. On the 10th day he was well enough to sit up for most of the day, and on the 12th he walked out to the barn with her in the morning and helped her carry hay, working slowly and not lifting anything heavier than he should, and she watched him out of the corner of her eye and found she was glad of the company in a way that went beyond mere usefulness. He had a natural ease with the animals. Her 2 horses, a bay mare named Clara and an older gray gelding named Deacon that had been Edmund's and was not friendly to strangers, both took to him quickly. He spent a long time with Deacon especially, talking to the old horse quietly while he worked, and she found herself pausing in her own work to listen to the low murmur of his voice without being able to make out the words. Señora Vasquez came on the 14th day. She was a short, broad woman of perhaps 55 with dark, sharp eyes and a manner that missed nothing, and she appeared at the kitchen door with a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, and she looked at Tobias Prescott, who was sitting at the kitchen table cleaning the leather of his saddle, which Hester had retrieved from the road on the second day, and she looked at Hester, and she handed over the cheese without comment. They spoke in the kitchen while Tobias worked in the front room. Senora Vasquez asked in the direct way she had whether this was the same man she had heard about in Springer, a drifter who had shot a man in the saloon there. "I've heard his account of it," Hester said, and I believe him. The man he shot apparently had a history of starting what he couldn't finish. The sheriff in Springer sent no men after Tobias. If it had been murder, there would have been a pursuit. Senora Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "He is handsome," she observed. "He's a patient who needed care," Hester said. "He is no longer so much a patient," Senora Vasquez said. "He is cleaning a saddle in your front room." Hester met her neighbor's eyes, and the two women looked at each other with the particular candor of people who have been honest with one another long enough to see through the decorative versions of things. "He is someone I don't mind having around," Hester said, which was the most truth she was prepared to offer. Senora Vasquez nodded once and accepted the broth Hester offered and stayed for an hour, and when she left she said, without looking back, "He watches you when you're not looking, like a man who is trying to decide something." Hester stood in the doorway and watched her neighbor walk down the road, and she thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She had not asked herself directly what she felt about Tobias Prescott. She had been too busy doing what needed doing to sit down with herself and ask the question plainly. But the question was there. She recognized it now, sitting in the back of her thinking like something that had been waiting patiently for her to have a free moment. She was lonely. That was honest, and she could not pretend otherwise. The loneliness had been there before Edmund died, if she was entirely truthful, because Edmund had been a man of great charm and not very much depth, and the loneliness of being with someone who cannot quite reach you is its own particular kind. After he died, the loneliness had become cleaner, at least. There was no longer the confusion of loving someone and being disappointed by them simultaneously. But Tobias Prescott was not Edmund. That was becoming clearer to her daily. He talked to her as though her opinions were genuinely interesting to him. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. He carried his share of the work without being asked and without making a ceremony of it. He had a humor about him that surfaced quietly in small observations, and she had laughed twice in the last 3 days, properly laughed, in a way she had not done since before the spring. That evening after supper, he helped her wash the dishes, standing at the basin and handing them to her to dry, and they were talking about something she had read in the newspaper from Albuquerque, a piece about the Lincoln County troubles that had only recently settled down, the affair that had involved Billy Bonney and so many others. Tobias had views on the matter that were careful and not quite what she expected, and she was responding to them when she looked up and found him looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking that I haven't talked like this in a very long time, maybe ever." "Like what?" He thought about it. "Like what I say matters to someone," he said. "Like what they say matters to me." The kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit and the cold outside was pressing against the windows, and she looked at him for a moment, and she felt something shift in her chest, the particular internal movement of something that has been very carefully held in place beginning to loosen. "It does," she said, "matter to me." He nodded once slowly, and she handed him the dry dish to put away, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the air in the kitchen was different after that, charged with something new that was not unpleasant. 2 weeks became 3. He began to help with the work in earnest, his wound healing well and his strength returning in steady increments. He fixed the north fence line that had been giving her trouble, spending 2 full days at it with methodical patience, and he rehung the barn door that had been listing badly, and he cleaned and oiled the pump at the well that had been sluggish all autumn. He did not ask permission for any of it or announce his plans. He simply saw what needed doing and did it, the way a person does when a place has begun to feel like their responsibility. She found herself watching this with a complicated feeling that she was beginning to be willing to examine. She had been managing this homestead alone for 8 months. She had been doing it adequately, doing it with the determined competence that was her nature, but it had been heavy. The simple fact of another person at the supper table, of footsteps in the barn she had not made herself, of a voice in the yard calling to Deacon, had lightened something she had stopped noticing was heavy. But she was careful with herself about it. She was not so far from grief that she did not know the difference between gratitude and something more complicated, and she was not the kind of woman who confused need with love. She watched him and she thought about him, and she let the feeling develop without pushing it, the way you let bread rise. The thing that broke the careful equilibrium between them was something small, which is usually how these things work. She was mending a harness at the kitchen table on a gray afternoon, 3 weeks and 2 days after she had pulled him through her front door, when he came in from outside with a look on his face that she had not seen before. He sat down across from her without taking off his coat. "I need to tell you something," he said. She set the harness down. "The man who's been following me," he said. "His name is Caleb Frey. He was in Cimarron yesterday." She was very still. "Senora Vasquez has a cousin who trades there," he said. "She sent word this morning. Frey was asking questions. Asking about a drifter with a wound. How do you know it's about you?" "I don't know for certain," he said. "But Frey is 25 years old and he is his brother's only family, and his brother is dead on account of me, even if the shooting was righteous. That kind of thing doesn't let a person rest easy." She looked at him. He was sitting across from her with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set, and she could see that he was preparing to say something she would not like. "No," she said before he said it. He blinked. "Hester, I know what you're going to say," she said. "You're going to say that you'll leave, that you'll draw him away from here, that it's not fair to put me in danger, and I'm telling you no before you finish saying it." He looked at her steadily. "It's my trouble," he said, "not yours. It became mine when I pulled you through that door," she said, "and you are not healed enough to be riding off into December across the territory to face a man who wants you dead. I'm healed enough." "Your stitches are 3 weeks old," she said. "You are not healed enough. Hester." "Tobias." She said his name with the same precise calm she said everything, but she could hear something underneath it that was not quite calm. "I'm not sending you out of this house because a man is asking questions in Cimarron. If Caleb Frey comes to this property, he will find me standing in his way, and I have already told you I know how to use the rifle." He was looking at her with an expression she still could not fully read, but it was doing something to his face that she did not want to look away from. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever known," he said. "I have been called that before," she said. "I take it as a compliment." He let out a breath. He leaned back in his chair, and he looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she could see him working through the argument, looking for the angle she hadn't covered. He didn't find it. "All right," he said. "But if he comes we deal with him together," she said. "Agreed." He looked at her for a long moment. "Agreed," he said. But Caleb Frey came to the homestead 4 days later, and he came in the middle of the afternoon when the sky was clear and cold and the light was flat, and he came on a decent horse and he came alone, which told Hester something about him that she noted carefully. She saw him coming from a quarter-mile out, and she had the rifle in her hand before he reached the gate, standing on the porch with it held loosely, not pointed but present, and Tobias was at her side. He had his own revolver, recovered when Hester had gone back up the road to retrieve his horse, which had found its way to water and was standing exhausted in a dry wash. She had brought the horse back and stabled it, and the revolver had been in the saddlebag. Caleb Frey was younger than she had imagined. He was lean and sun-darkened, and he had his older brother's eyes, probably, or something of them, because there was a grief in his face that lay under the hardness like a stone under shallow water. He pulled up outside the gate and he looked at the two of them on the porch, and he said nothing for a moment. "Prescott," he said. "Frey," Tobias said. The man on the horse looked at Hester and the rifle and then back at Tobias. "I'm not here to kill anybody," he said. "I thought I was when I left Springer. I thought that's what I wanted." He stopped. He looked down at his horse's neck and then back up. Samuel was my brother. He was also a man who picked fights until he found one he couldn't win. I've been burying that truth for 3 weeks while I've been riding around in the cold telling myself it was different. The three of them were very still. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. He drew on you, Tobias said. Is that what happened? He put his hand on his gun first, Tobias said. There were 6 men in that saloon who saw it. I didn't want to kill anyone. I didn't go there wanting that. Caleb Frey sat on his horse for a long time. I know, he said finally. I know that's probably true. Samuel was always reaching for something that wasn't there. He looked at Hester again as if she were a piece of the picture he was still assembling. I just needed to see you, he said to Tobias. See the man. I don't know what I thought that would do for me. Did it help? Tobias said. Another long pause. Maybe, Caleb Frey said. Maybe a little. He turned his horse. I won't be coming back, he said without turning around. You've got my word on that. He rode back the way he had come, and the road swallowed him up, and eventually the sound of his horse's hooves faded out, and there was nothing but the wind in the cottonwoods and the two of them standing on the porch. Hester let the rifle down. Her arms were very steady. Her heart was less so. Tobias turned and looked at her. She looked back at him. Well, she said. Well, he agreed. She went inside and she put the rifle back on its hooks, and she stood in the front room for a moment with her hands at her sides, and she became aware that what she was feeling was not the aftermath of danger, which she was equipped to handle. What she was feeling was something else. It was the particular sharp recognition of how much she had not wanted him to leave, not just in the practical context of a wounded man in December, but in every context. The thought of that road outside empty of any particular set of footsteps was something she was not prepared to accept. She heard him come in behind her. She heard him close the door, and she heard him stand there. She turned around. You could stay, she said. It came out simply, without calculation, the way the most important things do. Not because you're wounded, not because it's December, because this place needs someone, and you're the right kind of someone, and she stopped. I have been alone for 8 months, and I did not know how alone I was until you were here, and I found myself not wanting to go back to it. He was looking at her with something in his face that she recognized now, finally, as the thing Senora Vasquez had described. The expression of a man who has been deciding something. I have been deciding something, he said, as if she had spoken that thought aloud. And I decided it about a week ago, he said, but I didn't know if I had the right to say it. She looked at him with the direct patience that was characteristic of her and waited. I haven't been looking for anything in particular these past few years, he said. Or I have, but I couldn't have told you what it was. And then I walked 2 miles in the dark with a hole in my side because I saw a light in a window, and you pulled me inside and you fought an infection for 2 days without sleeping, and you stood on your porch with a rifle in your hands when you were afraid. And he stopped. He started again. And I know that this is too soon, and I know that you have had losses, and I know that you don't need anything from anyone. You have made that remarkably clear. Something in his expression was soft, and it did not look like weakness on him at all. But I would very much like to be the reason you stay not alone, if you'd let me try to be that. The room was warm. The fire was low and the light was soft, and outside the window the Sandia Mountains were going pink in the afternoon sun, and Hester Rourke stood in the front room of her homestead and looked at Tobias Prescott, and she felt the last of the careful held-in-place thing let go entirely. I think, she said, that you had better come sit down and we can talk about how you'd like to try. He did. He sat beside her on the horsehair settee, the one that had been his bed for the first 2 weeks, and they talked until the fire burned down, and then they built it back up and they talked some more. And outside the sky went from pink to purple to black, and the stars came out hard and bright over the desert. And in the house there was lamplight and coffee, and 2 voices speaking in the particular cadence of people who are telling each other the true version of themselves. She told him about Edmund, the real version, not the grief-edited one she gave to neighbors. She told him about the drought summer and the flood year, and the long winters that had felt longer, because she was managing them alongside someone who was not quite present even when he was standing in the room. She told him that she had married Edmund at 23 because it was the expected thing, and because she had thought she loved him, and she had not known yet that she was describing the idea of him rather than the actual person. He told her about Missouri and the years on the trail, and the specific quality of loneliness that comes from being always in motion, always welcome as hired hands are welcome, which is to say temporarily and conditionally. He told her about Kansas and the failed farming and what it felt like to stand in a field of failed wheat and understand that this was not where your life was. "Did you know," she asked, "when you fell against the gate, did any part of you know this was the place?" He thought about it honestly. "I think I knew the second you turned me over," he said. "You looked at me like I was a problem that needed solving and you were not going to be defeated by it. I've never had anyone look at me like that before." He paused, "Like I was worth the trouble." "You are worth the trouble," she said. He looked at her and the lamplight was warm between them and she saw him make the decision a moment before he made it, and he leaned forward and kissed her very carefully, "The way you handle something that matters to you," and she kissed him back with the quiet conviction that was characteristic of everything she did. When they drew back, she was looking at him with an expression she was not trying to manage or contain. "All right," she said. "Let's be sensible about this." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh fully until that moment, and the sound of it was very good. "All right," he agreed. "Let's be sensible." Sensible, in the context of 1879 in New Mexico territory, meant a courtship period that satisfied the terms of propriety, while neither of them pretended that they were not already fully committed to the conclusion. It meant Tobias moving from the front room settee to the small room in the barn that Edmund had used as an office, which had a cot and a stove and was weatherproof, and spending his evenings in the house at supper and after. It meant Señora Vasquez coming by more often than was strictly necessary for neighborly purposes, with her sharp dark eyes taking in the state of things and her expression offering a satisfaction she did not put into words. Christmas came. They celebrated it with a meal that Hester had been quietly planning since the first week of December, when she had thought she would be eating it alone, and which she now made with a thoroughness that reflected the occasion. She had a dried peach pie and a roasted chicken from the coop and cornbread and sweet potatoes, and Señora Vasquez came with her husband Raphael and their daughter Elena, who was 17 and looked at Tobias and Hester all evening with the transparent delight of a young person watching a love story develop. Tobias had carved something. She discovered this on Christmas morning, a small horse, no bigger than her fist, made from a piece of cottonwood and finished smooth. It was Clara, she realized, looking at the proportions, the particular way the mane fell. He had been watching her horse closely enough to render it. She held it in both hands for a moment and she looked at him across the breakfast table. "When did you do this?" she said. "Evenings," he said. "The barn has good light in the evenings if you position the lamp right." She held the small carved horse and she felt something in her throat that she converted into a deep breath, because she was Hester Rourke and she was composed. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," she said, which was the truth. He looked at her with that expression she had stopped trying to categorize and simply allowed. "I'll make you more," he said. "I've got a lot of evenings." January came in hard and cold. There was a stretch of 10 days when the temperature dropped so severely that the pump froze and the animals needed checking 3 times a day, and the two of them worked the homestead through it with the efficient synchrony of people who have learned each other's rhythms. She noticed how he anticipated her, how he would appear in the barn when she was going there, how he would have the coffee ready at the time she came in from the cold, not because she asked, but because he was paying the kind of attention that comes from genuine care. She returned the attention. She noted what he liked to eat and she made it when she could. She left books on the table that she thought would interest him and did not mention that she had done so. She learned that he had a recurring pain in his right shoulder from an old fall from a horse, and she did not draw attention to it, but she noticed when he was working in ways that aggravated it, and she arranged the work so that it didn't, without making it a conversation. This was, she thought, what people meant when they talked about building a life together. Not the grand gestures, not the speeches under stars, though those had their place. It was the accumulated weight of being seen, of being the person someone was paying attention to. In February, he rode to Cimarron. He was gone 2 days, and she did not let herself be anxious about it, or she tried not to be, and she was mostly successful. He came back on a gray afternoon with snow in his hair and a paper in his coat pocket which he put on the kitchen table and slid toward her. She looked at it. It was a claim form. He had registered the adjacent 40 acres, the parcel east of her homestead that had been empty as long as she had lived there, in his name. She looked up at him. The land office said it was available, he said. It shares a fence line with your north pasture. With some work it could give us enough additional pasture to run cattle properly instead of just the 2 cows. She looked at the paper and then at him. You're staying, she said. I told you I was looking for something that felt like staying, he said. I found it. I'm staying. She looked at the paper again because she needed somewhere to put her eyes that wasn't his face for a moment. That's the most practical love declaration I've ever encountered, she said. I have another kind if you prefer it. She looked up. He came around the table, and he took both her hands and he looked at her with the full weight of everything that had accumulated between them over these past months. The fever and the gate, and the rifle on the porch and the carved horse, and the long evenings of conversation and the Christmas dinner and the frozen pump and all of it. And he said, Hester Rourke, I walked 2 miles in the dark, and you pulled me out of the cold, and you saved my life, and I have not once since that morning found a reason to leave. I don't intend to look for one. I would like to marry you if you'll have me. The kitchen was warm and the snow outside the window was falling in the particular soft way it fell when it planned to stay for a while, and she stood with her hands in his, and she felt the full solid weight of the happiness she had not expected to find again, pressing against the inside of her chest like something that needed more space than she currently allocated to it. I'll have you, she said. I have been having you for 3 months. I simply want the paper that says so. He pulled her forward and she went willingly, and he held her in the kitchen of her house, his house now, with the snow coming down outside and the fire at their backs, and she put her face against his shoulder and she thought that this was what it felt like when a thing was right. Not easy necessarily, not without complication or history or the particular weight of everything that had come before, but right, solidly, fundamentally, unambiguously right. They were married in March, when the snow had pulled back from the lower elevations, and the cottonwoods along the creek were showing the first tentative green. The ceremony was in the small adobe church in the village 2 miles south of the homestead, performed by a minister who came through from Albuquerque once a month, and who looked at the 2 of them with the pragmatic approval of a man who had married enough couples to know the ones who meant it. Señora Vasquez cried. She was absolutely unsentimental about it and cried anyway. Raphael shook Tobias's hand for a long time without saying much, which in Raphael's way was a significant endorsement. Elena wore her best dress and watched the whole proceedings with the transparent joy she had never learned to conceal. Hester wore her best dress, the dark blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and she had put her hair up with the pins Edmund had given her, and then she had taken those pins out and used different ones. The plain tortoiseshell one she had bought herself in Santa Fe 2 years before, because this day was its own thing and did not need to carry any other day's weight. She stood in the small adobe church with the winter light coming through the high windows, and she looked at Tobias Prescott standing beside her, this man who had fallen against her gate in the dark and turned out to be everything she had not known she was waiting for. And she said the words of the ceremony with the clear, steady voice she brought to everything that mattered. He said them back. His voice was steady too, but she could see in his face what the steadiness was containing, and the sight of it made her grip his hand tighter. They rode home together in the afternoon light, the mountains bright above them and the air smelling of thawing earth and the creek running fast with snowmelt, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat with his arm around her, and she let the familiar landscape of her homestead come toward her, and she thought that it looked different now, or she looked at it differently. She could not decide which. Fuller, like a room that has had the right piece of furniture added to it. Spring brought work, as spring always did, and they worked it together. Tobias began clearing the east 40 acres, the land he had claimed, breaking the hardpan with methodical patience. He had found that he was better at farming than he had believed in Kansas. It was not the farming that had been wrong in Kansas, he told her. It was the loneliness of it. Working alongside someone changed the nature of it entirely. She taught him the particular economy of the homestead she had developed over years, where things were kept and why, which suppliers in Cimarron were reliable and which were not, how to read the weather off the mountains and what the behavior of the creek told you about the snowpack. He listened with the full attention he gave to things that interested him, asking questions that showed he had understood what came before. She found she liked teaching him. She found she liked being the one who knew more about something, which was a pleasure she had not had with Edmund, who had not been particularly interested in her knowledge. In return, he taught her things. He knew more about cattle than she did, the specific practical knowledge of trail driving that she had learned only theoretically from books and almanacs. He knew carpentry well enough to add a proper room onto the east side of the house, which they framed out in June and finished by August, a room that was meant to be a bedroom for the children they had not yet had but hoped for. She had told him early in their courtship, with the plainness she applied to difficult topics, that she and Edmund had tried to have children without success. She did not know whose failure it had been, only that it had not happened. She told him this so that he understood the possibility existed that it would not happen again, and he had listened and said that he understood and that whatever came, he was not going anywhere. She discovered in July that she was with child. She did not tell him immediately. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days, turning it over carefully, letting herself feel what she felt about it, which was a mixture of joy so acute it frightened her, and a fear she recognized as the reasonable fear of a woman who had wanted this before and not received it. On the 4th day she told him over supper, without preamble, the way she did things. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. He went very still. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be at this stage," she said. He sat with it for a moment, looking at her across the table, and then he put his fork down and he reached across and covered her hand with his. "Hester," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you afraid?" "Yes," she said, "and very happy, both at the same time." "That seems right," he said. He came around the table and he crouched beside her chair so they were at the same level, and he looked at her with something in his face that she thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "I'm going to take very good care of you," he said. "I know that," she said. "I've never doubted it. The pregnancy was not easy." She had been warned by Señora Vasquez that first pregnancies for women past 25 could be more demanding, and Señora Vasquez proved to be correct. She was sick in the mornings through most of July and August, and she was tired in a way that she was not accustomed to being, a bone-deep tiredness that sat under everything. She kept working, because she was Hester Rourke and stopping was not in her vocabulary, but she let Tobias take more of the heavy labor without argument, which he recognized as the significant concession it was. He was attentive in practical ways. He arranged the morning chores so that the worst of them were done before she was up, so that the smells that made her sickest were largely dispersed by the time she came outside. He drove to Cimarron for supplies himself rather than sending her on the long wagon ride. He cooked supper more often than not, because by evening she was frequently too tired to manage it, and he was a better cook than she had expected, resourceful with what was available and untroubled by the repetitive nature of homestead cooking. In the evenings they sat together on the porch when the weather permitted, watching the mountains go purple in the dusk, and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they talked or didn't talk and both were comfortable. She told him once that she had not known that being with someone could be this restful, that she had thought partnership meant constant management, constant reading of moods and needs and adjustments to keep the peace. "It shouldn't cost you this much," he said. "Being with someone shouldn't be that kind of work." "It was with Edmund," she said, not bitterly, just as a fact. "I know," he said. "How do you do this?" she asked. "Be easy to be with." He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to her questions. "I think it's because I'm not trying to be anything other than what I am," he said. "I spent years on the road being whoever the situation needed, trail hand, hired carpenter, whatever fit. I got tired of it. When I got here, I just stopped. I just am what I am. If that's good enough for you, then we're all right." "It's more than good enough," she said. The baby came in late February, a year and 2 months after Tobias had fallen against her gate. Senora Vasquez came to help with the delivery, and it was a long night and a harder morning, and Hester was magnificent in the way she was magnificent at everything she undertook, which was to say she was absolutely determined, and she saw it through. The child was a boy. A healthy, substantial boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn jaw. And when they put him in Tobias's arms, Hester watched her husband's face do something she had never seen it do before. A complete and total dissolution of every composed thing about him, replaced by something so open and so full that it was almost difficult to look at directly. She was exhausted, and the gray winter morning was coming through the bedroom window, and Senora Vasquez was cleaning up with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has attended many births, and Tobias sat in the chair beside the bed with their son in his arms, and he looked from the baby to her and back to the baby, and he said very quietly, "Thank you." "We did that together," she said. "No," he said. "You did the work, I was just present." "Your presence matters," she said. "It has always mattered." They named him James Edmund Prescott. The James was for Tobias's father, who had died when Tobias was 12, and the Edmund was for Hester's late husband, because she had decided, in the quiet way she decided things, that honoring the life she had lived before did not diminish the life she had now. Tobias had agreed without hesitation, which told her something about the quality of his character that she already knew but always appreciated confirming. The East 40 acres came into cultivation that second spring. They planted corn and winter wheat on the cleared land, and they ran 12 head of cattle on the combined pasture of both properties, which Tobias managed with the practical knowledge of his trail-driving years, and the homestead that had been adequate for one person became productive in a way it had not been before. It was not wealthy. That was not the territory in 1879 and 1880, and they were not those kinds of people. But they were comfortable. They had enough and then some, and they had the satisfaction of watching it come from their own work, which is a different and better kind of enough than the kind that comes from elsewhere. James grew rapidly and enthusiastically in the way that healthy babies do, and he had strong opinions from an early age that were so clearly his mother's that Tobias found it endlessly delightful. He would lie on a blanket in the summer sun and regard the world with the measuring, assessing look of a person who is deciding whether it meets his standards, and Tobias would say, "He gets that from you," and Hester would say, "I see nothing wrong with having standards," and the look on her face when she said it was exactly the same as the look on the baby's. Summer brought a visit from Tobias's sister, Martha, who had come west on the train as far as Albuquerque and then taken the stage north. She was 32, small and energetic, with her brother's dark eyes and a directness that immediately won Hester's respect. She stayed 2 weeks, and she spent a great deal of the time watching Tobias and Hester with an expression of visible relief. "I was worried about him," she told Hester, on the second day, with her brother out of earshot working the east field. "He's been drifting since the war ended. Not because he was damaged exactly, just because he couldn't find anything worth stopping for." "I know," Hester said. "He told me." "He told you," Martha said, as if this were remarkable. "He barely told me, and I'm his sister." "He talks to me," Hester said simply. Martha looked at her with those dark eyes. "Take care of him," she said. "He'll never say that he needs it, but he does. Everyone does." "I know," Hester said. "He takes care of me, too. We have an arrangement." Martha laughed. The letter came in October from the land office in Santa Fe. The territory was formalizing property claims in anticipation of eventual statehood, which everyone agreed was coming, and the letter was routine, a request for documentation of their respective claims and the status of improvements made. Tobias handled the correspondence with the land office over several weeks, and when it was resolved, he came home one afternoon with a document that he put on the kitchen table beside the claim form from 18 months earlier. "What's this?" she asked. "Combined title," he said. "I asked them to issue it jointly. Both names. Hester and Tobias Prescott, 80 acres. He looked at her. "I should have thought of it sooner." She looked at the document and the two names written on it side by side, and she felt again that fullness in her chest. "You are consistently the most practical romantic I have ever encountered," she said. "Is that a compliment?" "It is the highest one I know how to give," she said. He sat down and pulled her close, and she sat with him at the kitchen table, with the October light coming through the window and James asleep in the new room, and the mountains blue in the distance, and the title document with both their names on it lying on the table. And she thought about the morning when she had woken to a sound at her gate, and gone out into the cold with a derringer, and found a man bleeding in her frozen yard, and made the decision that would determine the rest of her life. She was glad every day that she had gone out. She was glad that she had pulled him inside. She was glad that she had been the kind of woman who went toward the difficult thing rather than away from it, because the difficult thing had turned out to be the best thing that had ever come to her gate. "I want to ask you something," she said. He waited. "That morning," she said, "when you walked 2 miles with a bullet in your side, were you scared?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "Not of dying exactly, more of disappearing. Just ceasing without anyone knowing it had happened, without having been anywhere long enough to matter." She turned her head and looked at him. "You matter," she said. "You matter considerably. You matter to me, and you matter to James, and you matter to Senora Vasquez, and to Martha, and to Raphael, and to old Deacon out there in the barn who has not been friendly to a stranger in 10 years but follows you around like a dog." She said it plainly, the way she said everything, but the plainness of it made it more rather than less. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I know that now. It's the first time in a long time I've been sure of it. The second winter was easier than the first." They had the additional room now, and the new stove Tobias had bought from a supplier in Albuquerque, and the cattle were doing well enough that there was money for a few additional comforts that the homestead had previously done without. Senora Vasquez's daughter Elena had married a young man from the village, a steady carpenter named Miguel, and they had begun their own small homestead a mile the other side of the Vasquez property, and the 4 of them became a loose community of families who shared labor and supplies and occasional evenings. Hester had begun keeping a proper account book for the homestead, something she had done imperfectly when she was alone. Now she kept it with meticulous care, recording every purchase and sale and projection, and she discovered a satisfaction in the numbers that she had not known was available to her. Tobias would lean over her shoulder in the evenings and follow her figures and ask questions, and she would explain, and he would offer observations from the cattle side that she incorporated, and it became a collaboration of the sort she had imagined marriage could be but had not previously found. James began to walk in the spring of his 2nd year, exactly as determined and unsteady as one would expect from a child of Hester's disposition, throwing himself forward with complete conviction, and sitting down hard and getting back up without visible distress. He had Tobias's ease with animals, fearlessly approaching Deacon in the yard, and the old gray gelding who had never been friendly would bend his head down to the toddler with a patience he showed no other creature, which Hester decided was one of the more touching things she had witnessed. A second letter came from Martha in the late spring. She was thinking of coming west. There was a schoolteacher position available in a town called Mora, not far south of them, and she had always wanted to teach, and the East was no longer holding her the way it had. She asked their opinion. Tobias wrote back immediately. He said, "Come." Hester added a paragraph of her own to the letter that said there was room in the house and a welcome that was genuine, and that she had long wanted a sister. Martha came in August. She came on the same train and stage as before, but this time with 2 trunks and a determination that was clearly permanent. She took the schoolteacher position in Mora, and she settled into the fabric of their life with the ease of someone who had always been meant to be in it. She came for supper twice a week, and she taught Hester to play cribbage, and she and James developed a conspiratorial friendship that expressed itself largely in her telling him stories and him sitting with his full attention focused on her face, which was the most flattering possible audience. 3 years after Tobias had fallen against her gate, on a December morning that was cold and clear in exactly the way that December morning had been, Hester stood at the kitchen window before dawn, and she looked out at the yard, where the frost was white on the ground and the gate was visible in the gray light, and she thought about the morning she had heard the crash of him against it. She heard him come into the kitchen behind her. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked over her head at the same view. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking about the morning you arrived," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "So am I," he said. "I think about it often." "What do you think about when you think about it?" She felt him consider the question. "I think about what would have happened if you hadn't come out," he said. "If you'd heard the sound and decided it wasn't your problem, or if you'd been a different kind of woman, I would have been found in the morning frozen in your yard." "I was always going to come out," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I think about, that it was always going to be you because you're exactly who you are." She leaned back against him and he put his arms around her and they stood at the window while the sky began to lighten over the mountains in the east, the particular slow drama of a desert dawn, the stars going out one by one, the darkness softening at the edges. "We're going to have another baby," she said. He went very still behind her. "When?" he said. "July, I think. Senora Vasquez agrees." He turned her around and he looked at her with that open, undone expression that she loved on him precisely because it was so unguarded, so entirely without performance. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Better than with James, actually. I feel quite good." He held her face in his hands, those capable, careful hands that had fixed the fence line and carved the little horse and held their son in the first minutes of his life, and he looked at her with everything he had and everything he was. "Hester Rourke Prescott," he said, "you are the most extraordinary thing that has ever come into my life." "You came into mine," she said, "uninvited and bleeding. And you let me in." "I always would have," she said. "Anyone worth letting in." He kissed her in the early morning kitchen with the light coming up outside and the frost on the yard and the fire at their backs, and their son sleeping in the next room and the gate standing open as it always did now, because there was nothing any more that needed to be kept out, and everything worth having was already inside. The second child came in June, not July, because the child had opinions about the schedule that Hester respected. It was another boy, smaller than James had been but equally vigorous, with his mother's lighter coloring and his father's disposition, which was to say easy and observant and quietly certain of himself. They named him William, for no particular ancestor but because it suited him, and James received him with the wary generosity of a toddler who is not entirely sure about the new arrival, but is willing to investigate. The homestead in the summer of that year was a full place. Tobias's cattle were doing well enough that they had hired a part-time hand, a young man named Diego from the village south of them, who worked 3 days a week, and who Tobias was teaching everything he knew about cattle with the same patient thoroughness with which he approached everything. Martha came every week and sometimes twice, and she and Hester had developed the particular close friendship of women who genuinely interest each other, built on the foundation of shared love for the same person but grown into something independent of it. Senora Vasquez's cheese operation had expanded with the addition of 2 more goats, and she and Hester had developed an informal exchange that had grown into something approaching a small business, with Hester's account-keeping providing Senora Vasquez a clearer picture of her own finances than she had previously had, and both women benefiting from the arrangement. Rafael Vasquez had told Tobias privately that Senora Vasquez was talking about the operation with more confidence than she had in years, which he attributed entirely to Hester, and Tobias had said he understood that entirely. The years settled around them. James grew from a determined toddler into a determined small person, with strong opinions about horses, and a habit of following Tobias around the property that Tobias found so touching he could not quite talk about it without his voice going different. William grew into a sweet-natured, observant child who had his mother's habit of watching things carefully before he committed to a position on them. There was a daughter eventually, a girl they named Ruth, who arrived 4 years after William and who had both parents' stubbornness concentrated in a single small person, which promised to be interesting for everyone involved. The homestead grew. The East 40 acres that Tobias had claimed that winter day in Cimarron produced wheat reliably by the 4th year, and the cattle herd grew to 22 head, and the combined enterprise of the two parcels, the 80 acres that bore both their names on the Santa Fe title, had become a real operation, something that could sustain the family and continue growing. What had not changed, through all the growth and the seasons and the babies and the expanding life of the place, was the specific quality of what was between them. It had deepened as the years passed, the way things deepen when they have real roots, and it had not lost any of the particulars that had made it itself. She still looked at him directly, and he still answered her honestly. He still paid attention to her in the daily, specific way that meant she was always known to him, and she returned that attention in kind. They still talked in the evenings, differently than they had at the beginning, the conversation of people who know each other well enough to skip certain explanations and go straight to the interior of things, but still with the quality of genuine interest that had characterized their first conversations at the kitchen table. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been on that December morning, lying in her bed unable to sleep, listening to the silence of a homestead that was too empty. She recognized that woman. She was not entirely different from her now. She still had the directness and the stubbornness and the clear-eyed practicality that had defined her all her life. But she was not empty anymore. She was not managing the loneliness by becoming so competent that it didn't have room to be felt. She was simply full, in the way that people are full when they are genuinely known by someone who chooses to stay. He had found his reason to stay. He had found it the moment she turned him over in the frozen yard and looked at him with the expression that said he was a problem worth solving. And everything since then had been the accumulation of reasons to confirm what he had known in that first moment. The fence lines, and the cattle and the title document with both their names on it, and the carved horses that now numbered a small herd on the kitchen shelf, and the children sleeping in the rooms they had built together, and the suppers and the mornings and the decades of evenings on the porch watching the mountains go purple in the dusk. On a morning in November, in the year 1885, 6 years after Tobias Prescott had fallen against Hester Rourke's gate before dawn, he stood at the gate with her in the early light, looking out at the road. It was a habit they had developed, a morning moment before the work of the day began, when they stood together and looked at the landscape and said whatever was in their minds and then went to what needed doing. The children were in the house. The mountains were white-capped and the air was cold and clean and the cottonwoods had gone golden along the creek. "I've been thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I've been thinking that this is the life I would have chosen," she said. If someone had asked me, before any of it happened, to describe what a life worth living looked like, this is what I would have described. He looked at her with those dark eyes that she knew as well as any landscape she had ever studied. "Even the part where I fell against your gate in the middle of the night bleeding. Especially that part," she said, "because it's the part that started everything else." He put his arm around her and they stood at the gate, the same gate he had fallen against in the dark, which was solid now and well hung, and would not rattle in the wind for another 20 years at least, because he had replaced the hinges in the second spring and done it right. The sun came up the color of copper over the mountains to the east. Inside the house, James, who was 5 now and already possessed of his father's ease and his mother's certainty, was probably waking his brother, and Ruth was probably issuing opinions about the situation in the carrying voice she had developed for exactly this purpose, and Martha was probably coming up the road from Mora for the Sunday visit she never missed, and Senora Vasquez's smoke was visible to the south. Her morning fire going in the hearth that had been going every morning of Hester's years in this valley. The gate stood open. It always stood open now. There was nothing coming down that road that was not welcome, and everything worth having was already here. Tobias looked down at his wife, and she looked up at him, and neither of them needed to say what they were thinking, because they had learned to occupy the same thought at the same moment, which is the real language of people who have been loving each other long enough and carefully enough to understand it fluently. She turned toward the house and the morning work and everything that was waiting to be done, and he turned with her, and the gate stood open behind them in the winter light, open to whatever came next, in the way that you can only leave a gate open when you are no longer afraid of what might come through it, when everything you feared has already been faced and everything you wanted has already arrived. The mountains were very bright that morning. The sky was the pure deep blue that the territory saved for its finest days. The creek ran fast with the early cold, and the cottonwoods rattled gold, and the cattle moved slow and warm in the pasture, and the horses were calling in the barn, and the smoke from the chimney of the house went straight up in the still air. It was a good morning. It was a very good morning. It was the kind of morning that reminded a person why they had chosen to stop and stay, why the moving had been necessary but the staying was better, why the gate of the right place, when you finally found it, was worth every mile of the road that had brought you to it. Hester Rourke Prescott went inside, and she made the coffee, and she listened to her children waking and her husband's boots on the porch steps, and the particular sound of a homestead that is genuinely alive, that holds people in it who mean something to each other. And she was grateful in the bone-deep, quiet, entirely certain way she was grateful for everything that was true and real and hers. And outside, in the bright December air of New Mexico territory, the gate stood open. It had always stood open. From the moment she had made the choice to go out into the dark and pull him inside, it had been open, and it would stay that way, because that was the kind of life they were living, the kind that had room in it, that made room, that was always willing to go out into the cold and see what needed bringing in. The coffee was ready. Tobias came through the door with William on his hip and James at his heels and Ruth's voice preceding all of them, and the kitchen filled up with everything that mattered, and Hester poured the coffee, and the morning began.